The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight of it, but the smell. It was the scent of new paint and uncured rubber, a sterile chemical odor that had no place in my machine shed. My shed smelled of 50 years of hot grease, diesel fuel, and the sweet, earthy scent of turned soil clinging to iron. This new smell was an intruder, a trespasser. Then I saw it, parked right where my Farmall M was supposed to be, squatting like a giant green toad, was a John Deere, a 4430 by the looks of it. The wraparound windshield of its Soundguard cab gleamed in the single shaft of late afternoon sun slanting through the dusty window. It was massive, bulbous, and utterly alien. The tires alone were taller than the hood of my old tractor. I stood there for a long moment, the handle of the 5-gallon bucket of hydraulic fluid I was carrying cutting into my palm. My heart, a steady old pump that had beaten through 71 years of harvests, droughts, and blizzards, gave a painful lurch. I set the bucket down, the metal clanging on the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, terrible silence where the familiar shape of my M should have been. The screen door of the house slammed shut, and my son Billy came jogging towards the shed, a wide, self-satisfied grin on his face. He was wiping his hands on a rag, though I knew he hadn't done a lick of real work all day. "What do you think, Dad? Ain't she a beauty?" He slapped one of the enormous rear tires, the rubber giving a dull thud. 140 horsepower. Turbocharged. Got a cab with air conditioning and a radio. No more eating dust for us. I didn't look at him. My eyes were fixed on the empty space. The dark, oil-stained patch of concrete where the M had sat for as long as I could remember. The spot where my own father had parked it after driving it home new from the dealer in '51. I could still see the faint outline of its narrow front tires in the packed dirt, like a ghost. "Where is it, Billy?" My voice came out low and rough, like gravel turning in a drum. His grin faltered for a second. "Where's what? The old Farmall? Dad, you gotta get with the times. I traded it in. The dealer gave us a hell of a deal on it for the down payment on this baby. We're in the big leagues now." Traded it in. The words hung in the air, heavier than a set of wheel weights. He hadn't sold a piece of machinery. He had sold a piece of our history. He had sold his grandfather's sweat, the calluses on my own hands. He'd sold the tractor I learned to drive on, the one I'd used to pull his mother's car out of a snowdrift the night he was born. He'd sold the engine, whose every cough and sputter I knew, like the beat of my own heart. "You had no right," I said, finally turning to look at him. I saw not my son, but a stranger wearing his face. A stranger filled with the easy promises of bank loan officers and the slick patter of equipment salesmen. "No right?" he scoffed, his confidence returning. "I'm a partner in this farm, ain't I? Or did you forget that? We've been talking about upgrading for years. That old thing was nickel and diming us to death. It's slow, it's dangerous, and it can't pull the new 6-bottom plow we need. This," he gestured to the green monster, "this is the future. Henderson next door got a new 1466 International last spring, and he was done planting before we even got the cultivator hooked up." I didn't hear the rest. All I could think about was my M, sitting on a dealer's lot, surrounded by strangers, its faded red paint, worn down to the primer on the fenders from my own overalls rubbing against it for decades, the little weld I'd laid on the battery box bracket in the winter of '68, the way the gear shift lever was worn smooth and shiny right where my hand always rested. Billy was still talking about acres per hour and fuel efficiency, but his voice was just a buzz in my ears. I walked past him, past the gleaming new Deere that he saw as a trophy and I saw as a tombstone. I went into the old milking parlour we used as a workshop, the air thick with the smell of cutting oil and rust. Tucked behind a stack of old seed sacks was a 5-pound coffee can. It was heavy. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the money I'd saved over 30 years. Cash. Money from side jobs, from selling a few extra hogs, from the year we had a bumper crop of soybeans. It was my rainy day fund. My funeral money, I'd sometimes joke to myself. I dumped the rolls of 20s and 50s onto the workbench, my hands shaking with a cold fury I hadn't felt in years. I stuffed the cash into the pockets of my canvas work coat, grabbed the keys to my '65 Ford F100 off the nail by the door, and walked out without another word to my son. He called after me, "Dad, where are you going? Don't be like this." I didn't answer. I climbed into the old pickup, the springs groaning in protest. It started on the second try, the straight-six engine, settling into a familiar, loping idle. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw Billy standing there, silhouetted against his new green tractor, a look of confusion on his face. He didn't understand. He didn't understand that some things aren't measured in horsepower or trade-in value. Now, before I tell you what happened when I got to that dealership, I have to ask you something. Have you ever had to fight for something, not because of what it was worth in dollars, but because it held the story of your life in its steel and grease? Let me know in the comments below. A man likes to know he's not the only one who believes some things are worth more than money. The drive to town was a blur of righteous anger. The 20 miles to the new mega dealership on the edge of the county felt like 1,000. They'd built it a few years back, a massive steel building with a paved lot the size of a football field, putting the small, family-owned implement stores out of business one by one. It was a place I'd avoided. It felt like a hospital for farms, a place where good sense and fiscal discipline went to die. I pulled my old Ford truck onto the lot, its faded blue paint and rust-streaked fenders looking like a poor cousin at a rich man's wedding. The lot was a sea of green and yellow, gleaming new combines with price tags that could buy a whole farm, tractors with tires that looked like they belonged on a moon buggy, and there, tucked away in the back row, looking small and tired and utterly out of place, was my Farmall M. My M. It looked like they'd just dropped it off the trailer and forgotten about it. There was a smear of grease on the hood where the transport chain had rubbed. A paper tag with a stock number was wired to the steering wheel. It looked abandoned, forlorn. I swung out of the truck and strode towards the glass doors of the showroom, my work boots crunching on the clean gravel. A young salesman in a polo shirt and creased slacks met me just inside. He had smooth hands and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his gaze flicking over my worn clothes, already sizing me up and dismissing me. "You took a Farmall M in on trade today from the Jensen farm," I said, my voice flat. "I want to buy it back." His smile tightened. "Oh, the old one?" "Yes." "Well, that's part of the deal we made with your son on the new 4430. A fine machine, by the way. He's going to be very happy with it." "I'm not here to talk about the new one," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm here for the old one. What's the price?" He leaned against a polished desk, crossing his arms. "Well, that's a little unusual. We generally send the older trade-ins straight to the auction. We only gave him $500 for it on the trade, but for a cash sale." He let the sentence hang, a predatory glint in his eye. He was going to squeeze me. He thought I was just some sentimental old fool. "You gave him $500, I stated. "I'll give you $600. Cash. Right now. That's a $100 profit for 10 minutes of paperwork." He chuckled, a slick, condescending sound. I don't think you understand. That tractor is part of a package deal. To unwind that, it's complicated. I'd have to talk to my manager. I'm sure we could work something out. But it'd likely be closer to 1,000. It's a classic, you know. Collectors are looking for those. He was lying. I could see it in his shifty eyes. My M wasn't a collector's piece. It was a worker. The paint was shot, the seat was torn, and the rear tires were mismatched, one Firestone and one Armstrong, both showing deep weather cracking in the sidewalls. There wasn't a collector in the state who'd pay $1,000 for it. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thick roll of bills. I started peeling off 20s, laying them on the polished surface of the desk, one after another. I didn't stop at 600. I didn't stop at 1,000. I kept going, the salesman's smug expression slowly melting into one of stunned disbelief. I laid out $1,500 in worn, folded bills, the sum total of 5 years of my secret savings. "There's $1,500, I said, my voice as hard as cold-rolled steel. "You can take it, write me a bill of sale, and I'll drive my tractor home. Or you can refuse, and I will personally make it my mission in life to stand at the entrance to this lot every single day and tell every farmer who pulls in exactly what kind of man you are. I'll tell them how you tried to fleece a 71-year-old man for the tractor his father bought him. I am Arthur Jensen. My word still means something in this county. Does yours?" He stared at the pile of cash, then at my face. The color had drained from his. He swallowed hard. Let me just get the paperwork." 10 minutes later, I had a bill of sale in my hand. I walked back out into the setting sun, my pockets empty but my heart full. I climbed onto the familiar iron seat of my M. It felt like coming home. I pulled the choke, turned the key, and hit the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a familiar, throaty roar that was music to my ears. It settled into a lopsided, clattering idle that I knew meant the number 3 cylinder's valve lash needed a slight adjustment. I put it in gear and drove it off that lot, right past the showroom window where the salesman was watching, a ghost in the fluorescent lights. I didn't look back. The sun was touching the horizon as I turned onto the county road, a long, 10-mile-per-hour journey ahead of me. The last rays of light glinted off the faded red paint. I was bringing my father's tractor home. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for tonight, I had won. The tension in our house for the next few weeks was a physical presence. It sat at the dinner table with us, a silent, unwelcome guest. My daughter-in-law, Carol, wouldn't look me in the eye. She saw my act of buying back the Farmall not as a defense of principle, but as a direct slap in the face to her husband, an undermining of his authority and his ambition. Billy was worse. He was a storm cloud of sullen anger, slamming doors and speaking to me only when absolutely necessary, his words clipped and sharp. "The bank called," he announced one evening, dropping the mail on the kitchen table. "They said the down payment was $500 short." I had to explain to Mr. Thompson that my father had some kind of episode and bought back the trade-in. "You made me look like a fool, Dad. You made me look like a child who can't control his own affairs." A man who sells his inheritance for a new toy already looks like a fool, I said quietly, not looking up from the carburetor I was rebuilding on the table. "You made a deal without consulting me. I unmade it." "It's my future," he exploded, his voice cracking with frustration. "That new deer is our ticket to finally getting ahead. We can pick up another quarter section, farm it properly. You and that relic." He gestured with his chin towards the shed. "You're holding us back. You're stuck in the Depression." and so we drew a line down the middle of the farm. It wasn't spoken, but it was understood. He had his new John Deere and the 200 acres he'd just rented on a handshake and a promise to the bank. He would work that ground, and the back 80 of our own place. I would stick to the original 160 acres, the home quarter, with my Farmall M and the old International 4-bottom plough that came with it. The community, as it always does in small towns, took sides. At the co-op, the talk was all about Billy's bold move. He was seen as a go-getter, a young lion. Henderson, my neighbour to the west, would corner me by the feed aisle. Heard Billy got himself a 44-430, Art, he'd say, a smirk playing on his lips. That's a real tractor. Me and the boy, we can knock out 100 acres of disking before lunch with our 1466. How's that old M of yours holding up? Still got a hand crank it on cold mornings? I'd just nod and say, "She runs fine, Tom," and walk away. I bore their condescension like a horse bears a harness. It was heavy, but I was used to heavy loads. That spring was a hard one. The rain came late, and when it did, it came in torrents, turning the fields to mud. It created a narrow window for planting, a frantic race against the calendar. Billy was out in his fields the first day the ground was fit to work. I watched from my workshop as he streaked across the horizon, his big disc slicing through the damp soil, the enclosed cab of the 4430 protecting him from the wind and the chill. He'd finish a pass, and from a mile away, I could hear the faint sound of the rock music he played on his radio. My turn was harder. The M didn't have the weight or the horsepower of the Deere. Where his tractor floated over the wet spots, mine threatened to bog down. I had to pick my way, working the high ground first, leaving the low spots to dry for another day. It was slow, tedious work. One afternoon, pulling the planter, I felt a lurch and a sickening bang from the tractor's rear end. I knew the sound instantly. A bull gear. I'd lost some teeth. I spent the next 2 days with the tractor split in half in the shed. The final drive was a greasy, complicated puzzle of heavy iron. I had to use a chain hoist to lift the cast iron housing, my old muscles screaming in protest. I found the broken gear, 2 teeth sheared clean off. I had a spare, one I'd pulled from a junked tractor a decade earlier. It was worn, but it was whole. I spent hours cleaning parts in a bucket of kerosene, my hands raw and chapped. I meticulously replaced the bearings and seals, torqued the bolts down in the correct sequence, just like the manual said. All the while, I could hear the steady drone of Billy's turbo diesel engine as he finished his planting, and then moved on to help Henderson with his. When I finally got the M bolted back together and filled with new gear oil, my body ached in places I'd forgotten I had. I turned the key, and she fired right up. I backed her out of the shed, the transmission whining a little louder than before because of the mismatched wear on the old gears. But she was running. I was 2 days behind. But I was running. That evening, Billy came into the shed as I was greasing the planter boxes. He didn't offer to help. He just stood there, his arms crossed, a look of pity on his face. "You know," he said, "the dealer has a service truck. I could have had them come out here. They'd have had you running in a few hours." I looked up at him, my hands black with grease. "They'd have charged me $300 for the privilege, son. I fixed it for the price of a few seals and a Saturday afternoon. This tractor," I patted the fender, "has no bank note. It has no monthly payment. When I fix it, it's with my own 2 hands, not with a checkbook. Every dollar that new machine of yours earns, a piece of it belongs to the bank. Every dollar this old girl earns belongs to us." He just shook his head and walked away. "You don't get it, Dad. You just don't get it." But he was the one who didn't get it. He saw the sweat and the grease and the long hours as failure. I saw it as freedom. The year was 1973, and the world, for a farmer, had gone completely, wonderfully mad. It started with the Russians, a massive grain deal, they called it, on the evening news. The Soviets had a bad harvest and were buying American wheat and corn by the shipload. Prices at the Chicago Board of a Trade, a place as distant and abstract to me as the moon, shot up like a rocket. Corn, which had been hovering around $1.20 a bushel for years, suddenly jumped to $2, then $2.50, then flirted with $3. For my son, Billy, it was the ultimate validation. It was as if God himself had reached down from heaven and rubber-stamped his decision to go into debt. His gamble was paying off, and in a spectacular fashion. With the big John Deere and the new 6-row planter he'd bought, he'd put in more acres than ever before. His yields were good, and with prices in the stratosphere, the money began to pour in. He paid off the operating loan from the spring in one lump sum. The bank manager, Mr. Thompson, who had been just a man in a suit a year ago, was now his best friend, clapping him on the back and calling him a visionary. Billy started carrying a new leather-bound ledger book and talking about cash flows and depreciation schedules. He traded his old pickup for a brand-new, top-of-the-line Ford F-250 Ranger with a 2-tone paint job and air conditioning. The success changed him. The sullen anger he'd held towards me morphed into a kind of patronizing pity. He saw me on my old Farmall, cultivating my corn, and he'd stop his big new truck on the road, lean out the window and yell, "You're burning daylight, old man. I could do that whole field for you in 2 hours." He meant it to be a kindness, I think, but it felt like a twist of the knife. He was no longer just my son. He was a success story, and I was the folksy, stubborn anecdote he'd tell his new friends at the bank about. That fall, the 80 acres bordering our farm to the north came up for sale. Old man Hemphill had died, and his kids, who lived in the city, wanted to cash out. It was good, flat, black dirt. Prime land. Billy saw his chance. He went to the bank, and with the markets on fire, they didn't just give him a loan. They practically begged him to take it. He bought the land, and before the ink was dry on the deed, he was at the dealership signing the papers for an even bigger disc and a brand-new International 1460 Combine. "You gotta spend money to make money, Dad," he told me, standing in the driveway next to his gleaming new machine. Secretary Butts said it himself. "Get big or get out. We're getting big." I had a good year, too. My corn and beans brought in more money than I'd seen in a decade. But I didn't see it as a new era. I saw it for what it was, a windfall, a lucky break. After I sold my grain, I took the check to the bank. I paid my property taxes, bought my seed for the next year, and paid cash for a new roof on the main barn, a job that was 20 years overdue. The rest of it, a sizable sum, I put into a savings certificate. Billy found out about it when he was at the bank and was aghast. "You're putting it in a savings account. Dad, that money is earning 3% interest. Inflation is running at 6%. You're losing money. You should be investing it, buying more land, leveraging your assets." "My only asset is this farm, Billy," I told him calmly. "And it's paid for. That's a feeling you don't understand yet." I was an island of old-fashioned caution in a sea of giddy optimism. Everyone was expanding. Everyone was borrowing. The dealership was selling new tractors as fast as they could get them in. The talk at the diner wasn't about the weather anymore. It was about land prices and interest rates. But the rates were low, and the land just kept going up in value. It seemed like a game you couldn't lose. One cold afternoon in November, I was at the bank, depositing the check from the last of my soybeans. I was standing in line, watching the snow flurries dance outside the big plate-glass window, when I overheard Mr. Thompson, the bank manager, talking to Frank Gable, another farmer from down the road. Frank was signing a stack of papers for a new four-wheel drive Steiger. "Now, Frank, this note is on a variable rate," Thompson said, his voice smooth as cream. "It's tied to the prime. It's at 7.5% now, which is a great deal." Frank looked a little nervous. "Variable? What happens if that prime rate goes up?" Thompson let out a hearty laugh. "Don't you worry about that. With the way the economy's booming and the grain markets are, those rates aren't going anywhere but down. This is the new normal, Frank. These prices are here to stay. You're going to be a millionaire on paper by this time next year." I finished my business and walked out into the cold air, pulling the collar of my coat up against the wind. But a different kind of chill had settled deep into my bones. The new normal. I'd heard that phrase before. I'd heard it in 1928, just before everything fell apart. I looked down the main street of our little town. It was lined with brand new pickup trucks. Out at the edge of town, the implement dealer's lot was lit up like a carnival, a monument to borrowed money and boundless hope. Everyone saw a boom. They saw high prices and cheap money and a future that could only go up. But as I stood there, watching the snow begin to stick to the pavement, I saw something else. I saw a sky full of dark, heavy clouds gathering on the horizon, a storm that no one else seemed to notice. And I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath my feet, that the rain was coming, and it wasn't going to be the kind that makes the crops grow. The boom years, as they always do, began to fray at the edges. It wasn't one single thing you could point to, but a collection of small worries that gathered like thunderheads on a distant horizon. The price of diesel fuel crept up, then jumped. A bag of seed corn that cost $12 in 1973 was suddenly $25, then $40. The cheerful voice of the Secretary of Agriculture was replaced on the radio by dour men in Washington talking about something called stagflation. For Billy, these were just costs of doing business. He was farming nearly 600 acres now, having rented another piece of ground from a widow who'd moved to town. His gross income was immense, a number that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. But his expenses were a ravenous beast that was never full. He had payments on the land, the 4430, the 1460 combine, the big disc, the new planter, and the shiny F-250. It took a mountain of cash just to break even, a fact he never spoke of, but which I could see in the tight lines around his eyes. The summer of '78 was the beginning of the end, though we didn't know it then. The sky turned a hard, bleached-out blue in June, and stayed that way. The rain simply stopped. The corn, which had shot up tall and green in the spring, began to suffer. The broad leaves curled inward during the day, a plant's desperate attempt to conserve moisture, giving the fields a sickly, greyish cast. The ground, that rich black Iowa loam, turned to concrete and then cracked open in patterns that looked like a dry riverbed. Billy's big equipment was useless. You can't cultivate dust. He spent his days in the air-conditioned cab of his pickup, driving the dusty section roads, staring at his dying crops and the cloudless, unforgiving sky. His mood grew as brittle as the cornstalks. I did what I could on my home quarter. I had an old 6-row cultivator with rolling shields, and I went out in the cool of the early mornings, driving the M in its lowest gear, just scratching the surface of the soil. It didn't make rain, but it broke up the crust, creating a dust mulch that helped hold what little moisture was left deep in the ground. It was an old dry farming trick my father had taught me. Henderson, my neighbor, laughed at me from the road. You're just making dust, Art," he yelled. Maybe I was, but I had to do something. My corn wasn't thriving, but it was surviving. The ears were small, the kernels shallow, but it was making a crop. Billy's, on the more marginal ground he'd rented, was a total loss, the stalks turning brown and brittle before they ever tasseled. The real trouble started in the heat of August. Billy was trying to get a head start on his fall tillage, pulling his massive 24-foot disc through a field of failed beans. He was pushing the 4430 hard, trying to work out his frustration on the unyielding earth. I was mending fence on the line between our properties when I heard it. Not a bang, but a high-pitched, metallic scream, followed by a sudden silence. I saw him climb down from the cab. He walked around to the back of the tractor, kicked a tire, and threw his hat on the ground. I wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of a greasy glove and walked over. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Hydraulics," he spat, his face flushed with anger and heat. "The pump went out. Can't lift the damn disc. Can't do anything." I looked at the big green machine. It was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a mystery. Its lifeblood was not diesel fuel and grease, but high-pressure hydraulic fluid flowing through a maze of steel lines and solenoid valves. It was nothing like my M, whose simple gear-driven pump could be rebuilt on a workbench in an afternoon. "No power steering, no brakes, no three-point hitch," he muttered, kicking the dust. "It's a 140 horsepower paperweight." He had to call the dealership. The service truck didn't arrive until the next morning. A young mechanic in a clean uniform hooked up a laptop computer to a port under the dashboard. He spent an hour running diagnostics before he even opened his toolbox. The verdict was grim. The main variable displacement hydraulic pump had self-destructed, sending metal shavings throughout the entire system. It wasn't a repair, it was a transplant. The bill came a week later. I saw Carol, my daughter-in-law, staring at it at the kitchen table, her face pale. Billy snatched it from her and crumpled it into a ball. Later, I smoothed it out of the trash can. The total was $4,728. It was more than my entire net income for the year. For Billy, it was a devastating blow, wiping out what little profit he might have salvaged from his good corn on the home place. The first deep crack had appeared in the foundation of his empire. That fall, a letter arrived from the bank. It was printed on crisp, formal letterhead. It was a notice that, due to a change in the Federal Reserve's prime lending rate, his variable rate mortgage on the Hemphill 80 would be adjusted upward by 2 full percentage points, effective immediately. It was just a single sheet of paper, but it felt as heavy as a tombstone. The storm I had seen gathering on the horizon was no longer distant. We could all hear the thunder now. The floor fell out in the winter of 1980. The president on the television announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. It was meant to punish them for invading Afghanistan, but for us, it was a shot to the heart. The price of corn, which had been holding steady, collapsed overnight. The export market we had built our entire boom upon vanished in the time it took a man in a suit to read a speech. What followed was a slow, grinding nightmare. The prime interest rate, the one tied to Billy's loans, didn't just go up. It skyrocketed. 10%, 12%, 15%. By the summer of 81, it was over 20%. The letters from the bank came every few months, each one a nail in the coffin. Billy's loan payments, which had been manageable, became monstrous. He was paying more in interest every month than my father had paid for our entire farm. The easy credit that had fueled the expansion dried up like a puddle in July. Mr. Thompson, the bank manager who had once slapped Billy on the back and called him a genius, now refused to see him without an appointment. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, professional stare. The operating loans for seed and fuel were cut back, then denied altogether. Billy tried to fight. He worked himself to the bone, trying to squeeze every last bushel out of the ground. He sold off the new pickup to make a land payment. He tried to sell the big combine, but no one was buying. The farm lots were full of used equipment from other farmers who were going under. The machine that had been his pride and joy was now just another liability, a depreciating asset on a balance sheet swimming in red ink. The stress ate away at him. He lost weight. He stopped sleeping. The easy laughter I remembered from his boyhood was gone, replaced by a grim, haunted silence. He and Carol fought constantly, their hushed, angry voices seeping through the farmhouse walls late at night. The dream was dying, and it was taking my son with it. Through it all I kept on. I farmed my 160 acres. My income was slashed by the low prices, but so were my expenses. I had no debt. The Farmall M didn't ask for a monthly payment. It ran on a little diesel fuel and a lot of my own sweat. When the magneto started acting up, I didn't call a service truck. I took it off, brought it to my workbench, and carefully replaced the points and condenser, a $5 repair. When a hydraulic line rusted through, I drove my old Ford F100 to the auto parts store, bought a new length of hose and 2 fittings, and fixed it myself in an hour. I survived. It wasn't glorious. There was no new roof for the barn that year or the next. We ate more from Carol's garden and bought less from the store. My savings certificate from the boom years sat in the bank, untouched, a small solid rock in a raging flood. The final notice came in the fall of 1982. It was delivered by a certified letter. The bank was foreclosing on the Hemphill 80 and would be holding a public auction to sell off Billy's equipment to satisfy the remainder of the debt. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect mirror of the mood that had settled over the county. The auctioneer set up his truck on our own farmstead, right in the yard where Billy had played as a boy. The machinery was lined up in a neat, funereal row. The 40430, the 1460 combine, the massive disc and planter. They were still relatively new, but they looked tired, monuments to a broken promise. The whole neighborhood was there, not out of spite, but out of a morbid curiosity and a shared sense of fear. They were there to see the fall of Billy Jensen and to wonder who would be next. Henderson stood near the back, his face ashen. His own expansion had been just as aggressive as Billy's. He wasn't watching an auction. He was watching a preview of his own future. Billy stood by the house, his arms crossed, his face a stone mask. Carol was inside with their young son, my grandson, shielding him from the sight of his father's public humiliation. I stood by the machine shed, my hands in my pockets, feeling a grief so profound it was a physical ache in my chest. This wasn't about a tractor anymore. This was about my son's spirit being broken on the anvil of his own ambition. The auctioneer started his rhythmic, hypnotic chant. The bidding was slow, pathetic. The market was flooded. A tractor that Billy had paid $60,000 for sold for $18,000. The combine went for a fraction of its worth. Each fall of the gavel was like a hammer blow to my son's soul. I watched him flinch with each sale, his mask cracking just a little. When it was over, Mr. Thompson from the bank, looking uncomfortable in his city suit, came over to Billy with a clipboard. He spoke in a low voice, but I could hear the words. "This satisfies the equipment loan, but you're still significantly underwater on the land, Billy. We'll have to proceed with the sheriff's sale on the 80. Billy just nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the grey sky. He looked like a man who had lost everything. But he hadn't. Not yet. I walked over to them, my old work boots silent on the trampled grass. Mr. Thompson saw me coming and his face tightened. He probably expected me to yell, to curse him out. I ignored him. I looked at my son. "It's over, Billy," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He finally looked at me, and for the first time in years I saw not the arrogant young businessman, but the lost little boy who used to run to me when he fell and scraped his knee. His eyes were filled with a terrible, empty shame. "It's all gone, Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I lost it all." "You lost some iron," I said. "You lost some dirt you never really owned. You haven't lost this." I swept my hand out, indicating the original 160 acres, the house his grandfather built, the barn I'd just finished residing myself. "This is ours. It's paid for. It's safe." Then I turned to the banker. "Mr. Thompson," I said, pulling a folded savings certificate from my inside coat pocket. It was the money from the boom years, the money Billy had told me I was a fool to save. "I believe this will cover what's owed on the Hemp Hill property. I'm buying my son's note." Thompson's jaw dropped. He looked at the certificate, then at me, his professional composure completely gone. He had seen me as a relic, a stubborn old man farming with junk. He had never once considered that I might be the one with the cash. I didn't wait for his reply. I put my arm around my son's shoulders. He was trembling. He leaned into me, and all the fight, all the pride, all the years of bitter resentment just collapsed. He buried his face in my shoulder, and the silent, racking sobs of a broken man shook his entire body. I just held him, my own eyes burning with tears, as the crowd of neighbors quietly, respectfully, got in their pickups and drove away, leaving a father and a son alone in the ruins of a dream. We didn't buy back the big green tractor. We let it go. In the weeks that followed, Billy and I worked side by side in a way we hadn't since he was a teenager. We didn't talk much about what had happened. We didn't need to. The silence was one of understanding, not anger. We were farmers again, not financiers. We took the Hemp Hill 80, which I now owned outright, and put it into soil-building alfalfa for a few years, letting the land heal. We farmed the home quarter, just the two of us. It was hard work. We were back to the four-bottom plough and the small disc. We were outmatched by the scale of modern agriculture, but we were solvent. We owed nothing to anyone. One crisp spring morning, we were in the shed, getting the old 6-row planter ready. Billy was replacing the seed plates. His hands, which had grown soft from years in an enclosed cab, were now calloused and stained with grease again. He stopped and looked over at the Farmall M, sitting there in its usual spot, its faded red paint looking almost dignified in the morning light. "You know, Dad," he said, his voice quiet. "All those years, I saw that tractor as a symbol of you holding me back, of being stuck in the past." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. It wasn't an anchor holding us down. It was an anchor holding us steady. I just couldn't see it." That was the only apology he ever needed to make. It was more than enough. Years passed. The farm economy slowly recovered. But it was a changed world. The go-go days of borrowing and expansion were over, replaced by a hard-won sense of caution. Many of our neighbors, like Henderson, had lost their farms. Their names were still on the mailboxes, but strangers were farming the land. Billy became a better farmer than I ever was. He was smarter, more innovative, but he was tempered now by the fire he had walked through. He learned to watch his costs as closely as he watched the weather. He never borrowed a dime he couldn't pay back in a year. The farm prospered in its own modest way. He eventually bought a newer, bigger tractor, a solid used Case IH, but he paid for it with cash he'd saved over 3 good years. My grandson Ben grew up in the shadow of the old Farmall. When he was 8 years old, I found him sitting on the iron seat, his small hands on the big steering wheel, making engine noises. I didn't shoo him away. I climbed up on the hitch behind him. "You like this old tractor?" I asked. "Grandpa," he said, his voice full of a child's simple awe. "Dad told me this tractor saved our farm." My heart swelled. I felt a lump form in my throat. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Well, that's a long story," I said, "but it's a true one. You see, this tractor isn't just about horsepower. It's about knowing the difference between what you want and what you need. It's about understanding that the land doesn't care if your paint is shiny. It only cares if you're a good steward. It's about owing your soul to the soil, not to the bank." I spent that afternoon with him in the shed, a bucket of greasy water and a handful of rags between us. I showed him how to check the oil. I let him hold the grease gun and pump fresh lubricant into the Zerk fittings on the front axle. I explained how the simple gasoline engine worked, how the spark plugs fired, how the carburetor mixed air and fuel. His hands, small and clean, were soon as black as mine. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the concrete floor of the shed, I looked at the boy, my son's son, his face smudged with grease and alight with curiosity. And I saw the future. The land would endure, the family would endure, and the lesson, paid for so dearly and learned so well, would be passed down, carried forward on the sturdy iron frame of an old red tractor that a stubborn old man refused to let go of. It was more than a machine. It was our history. It was our heart. And it was home.